Hello, I'm Elise Harris, and I'll be presenting on the Am I Next movement, which is a fight against gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. So femicide refers to the murder of a girl or woman, particularly by a man and on account of her gender. And South Africa has one of the highest femicide rates in the world, and the Eastern Cape region has the highest rate in the country. That's according to the Gender and Health Unit of the South African Medical Research Council. And these statistics have been the sad case for decades now. So in 2019, a 19-year-old UCT student named Uyinene became part of that statistic when she was brutally raped and murdered by a postal worker here in Cape Town. Her case became a turning point for South Africa's ongoing fight against gender-based violence, and the hashtag #AmINext movement emerged. So today, 5 years later, the movement continues to unite women and girls in Cape Town, in South Africa, and around the world against gender-based violence and femicide. So the hashtag #AmINext movement stemmed from a local social justice case, and it has become one of the biggest mobilizations against gender-based violence in South Africa. So looking at what the movement advocates for, who the primary activists are, and the social impact it's created highlights how and why this case was able to gain so much momentum. So fights against gender-based violence have been ongoing for many years, but this particular movement was born around Uyinene China. So I think it's very important to know about the person who is behind the movement. So Uyinene was murdered in August of 2019. She became a catalyst for the hashtag #AmINext movement in Cape Town, across South Africa, and beyond. And she was born and raised in Eastern Cape, and she has one older brother who is highly involved in a foundation that was made in her honor, which we'll discuss later. And she was a student at the University of Cape Town in her first year studying media and film. So about the movement. So simply stated, the hashtag #AmINext movement advocates for the ending of gender-based violence in South Africa, and specifically holding the government accountable for protecting girls and women, especially here in Cape Town. But the movement received considerable news coverage even in the US from major news companies, and CNN described it as, quote, a case that has come to symbolize the casual violence women in South Africa face, end quote. So the hashtag #AmINext began to trend on social media, and women around the world began to share their own stories of survival or loss, and voicing their fear and frustration, asking if they too would become victims of femicide. So the movement fueled protests and political activism, and it raised awareness on the pervasive violence against women, but it's important to note that Uyinene's case was not an isolated one. Her case was just one of a series of cases that had been highlighting the state's failure to protect its women and girls against violence, and her case was seen as kind of a tipping point in this movement. So there were mass protests and marches across South Africa, with specifically a call for the government to take action against persecutors. So the president of South Africa, President Ramaphosa, even spoke on the case, but there were 3 cases that happened around the time of hers, and he spoke on them jointly. And he spoke on the sentencing for Uyinene's killer, and then there was another case for a woman named Leandre Jangles, who was killed by her boyfriend very shortly after Uyinene. And then just days after that, the half-naked body of a 14-year-old girl was found in the backyard of a home in Cape Town. So the hashtag #AmINext movement, the demands the movement asks for go beyond like just simply raising awareness. It really advocates for systemic changes in government and law and policy. And they want to just ensure that the safety and protection of women is enforced by the government. So they've outlined 3 major objectives for the movement. So first, the activists demand stricter laws and enforcement. They want harsher penalties for perpetrators of gender-based violence, and they want better law enforcement training, more consistent application of the existing laws, because many activists point out that even though there are some laws in place, they are poorly enforced, and many perpetrators, the majority of perpetrators, actually go unpunished. Secondly, they want the government to have accountability. So they want the government to take tangible action toward ending gender-based violence, and this includes stricter reforms to the National Register for Sexual Offenders. They want better transparency in handling gender-based violence cases. They want increased funding for shelters and safe spaces. And on safe spaces, they want support for survivors and support for victims, thirdly. So the movement advocates for improved services for survivors of gender-based violence, including women who are fleeing hostile environment situations. So such as abusive environments, for them to have a refuge. So the combination of online movement and on the ground and in the political sphere and in the legal sphere really fueled these demands. And that's why the movement was able to gain so much momentum and gain so much attention worldwide, because they were advocating on so many different fronts. So just to understand the magnitude of the situation that fueled these demands, we can look at some statistics from the time of Uyinene's case. So at the time of her case in 2019, gender-based violence had risen significantly in South Africa, with sexual offenses, including rape, rising 4.6% that year. Across that year, there were over 21,000 reported murders, averaging about 58 murders a day. And I'm pretty sure that includes men and women. And if you look at the murder rates today, it's as high as 90 murders per day. And for reference, South Africa has a population of about 64 million. So also that year, there were over 52,000 recorded sexual offenses. And the World Health Organization, which records data for the murder rates of women and girls, put South Africa amongst the top 5 worst countries for this specific type of crime in the world. And all of this was reported by BBC News, and they got their information from World Health and local census data. So with staggering numbers like these, a movement this big will take time to produce significant change, but strong leadership is very important in the success of the movement and achieving the group's outlined goals. So here are some key activists driving the hashtag #MINext. So first we have Naledi Chirwa, and she's 31 years old. She's a prominent women's rights activist. She's been outspoken on gender-based violence in South Africa. She's a member of Economic Freedom Fighters. She's spoken out against the government and participated in protests, given speeches, called for accountability against gender-based violence. She's just used her voice to amplify the message of hashtag #MINext across political spheres and social spheres. And then secondly, we have Thuli Madonsela, and she is 62 years old. And she's a South African advocate and professor of law and justice at Stellenbosch University. She was also named a public protector of South Africa, which is a position I learned about. So this is one of the highest honors in the social justice sphere. So she's been an influential figure because of that role, and her credibility as a lawyer and her tenure as public protector has given weight to her voice in this fight. So she's advocated for legal reforms, stronger government action against gender-based violence. And then thirdly, Uyinene's own brother, Asana, has been a major activist in this movement. He's also a UCT grad. I think he also got his master's from UCT, so 2 degrees from the same university. And he's been very active in running the Uyinene Miritiana Foundation, which contributes to the fight against gender-based violence. And we'll learn more about that foundation next. But just looking at their ages from 26 years old to 31 and 62, I think it just shows, we previously spoke about, how mobilizing across generations really fuels a movement, where you can have credible voices from the youngest generation to the oldest generation. I think that's why this movement has been so successful, because the leaders span several generations. And speaking of activists, just the everyday women who have been on the front lines and participating online in #AmINext movement have all contributed to this movement. So her foundation, led by her brother, has been very pivotal in the fight against gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa, and in just keeping the #AmINext movement alive all these years later and for many to come. And the foundation has so many programs, like an exhaustive list of programs on their website, but they focus on advocacy, education, and just creating safer communities in South Africa. So some of the programs they have are annual anti-gender-based violence walks. They have youth development and education programs, and a lot of community engagement programs. So on the website, you can find a list of all that. You can learn more about who Uyinene was as a person, what she was studying, what her childhood was like, what her relationship with her brother was like. And you can learn more about the cause of the foundation and the cause of the #AmINext movement, and just see all of their events that they have going on. So as someone who didn't know about this movement before this, I was really able to visualize the social impact of it by looking at the photos. I think the photos did a great job of capturing it. So essentially, the social impact has been like a profound conversation about gender-based violence across South Africa. It's just forced conversations within the public sphere, in the social sphere, and in like the government sphere, conversations about gender-based violence. It's just increased the urgency of addressing femicide and violence in South Africa, and organizations like Uyinene's have continued that fight against gender-based violence. So her case prompted a national mobilization of millions of women sharing their stories, and I believe all of this played a role in the ultimate sentencing of her murderer. So as far as the impact of her case, in November, the post office worker was sentenced to life imprisonment. And the significance of this was that he was given 3 life sentences, 1 for murder and 2 for rape, 2 sentences for rape, even more than murder, after he pleaded guilty to all charges. So the quick conviction and the harsh sentencing was seen as a small but just victory, but the call for broader systemic changes, still demanding change and attention from the government, has continued, and addressing the things that allow these gender-based violences to flourish in South Africa. So just to wrap everything up, the #AmINext movement just continues to amplify the voices of young girls and women across Cape Town, across South Africa and the world, and the battle against gender-based violence and femicide. The significance of the movement goes beyond individual cases like Uyinene's, but it represents like a collective demand for systemic change, political change, legal change against the fight of gender-based violence. So while Uyinene's case brought a lot of ongoing global attention to the crises, the work, the movements, on the ground movements, and in all the different spheres show that it requires ongoing, very consistent action to make change, to garner change and achieve their goals. So the challenge today will just be keeping the activism alive until improvements are seen, until laws are changed, until the justice and safety of every woman in South Africa is ensured. Okay, thank you.